Report issued today alleging horrible abuse by the R.C.M.P. of Native girls and women in northern BC. The report calls for a national inquiry into the abuse and an inquiry into the missing Aboriginal women in BC over the last number of decades. Why not an inquiry?
Well, firstly, I just want to pick up on one last point before about people traveling and stopping elsewhere. You know, Nathan beside me has a riding in remote northern BC. Sometimes he has to stop and stay overnight in Vancouver, and that makes sense because of time or cost. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, and I think people should keep that in mind. And, you know, there are folks in the House that have records on housing allowances and so on. So let's not just pretend it's only the Senate. We always have to make sure that everybody's doing their best, and we want to enforce rules.
Okay,
that's what we try and do.
Fair enough. I'll give you that time. So why not an inquiry into these allegations of police abuse in northern BC?
Well, what we've done is we've actually asked the Civilian Complaints Commissioner for the R.C.M.P. to look into the questions that have been raised, and that's the appropriate place. If the issue is that the R.C.M.P. have not conducted themselves appropriately, that's what that body exists for, and that individual is there to do. In terms of the broader question, I know Bob Ray in the House today was asking a question about why wouldn't you refer this to the police and have another police force other than the R.C.M.P. deal with it? Well, Bob Ray was actually Premier of Ontario. He understands how policing works in Canada. Policing is actually a matter of provincial law and provincial jurisdiction. The R.C.M.P. only works in these provinces as a contract police force under provincial law. So, yeah, it's up to the province to make all that happen. It's an odd question to be asking the Prime Minister.
Okay,
but we have done the appropriate thing by asking the Civilian Police Complaints Commissioner to the extent that this is a question in our jurisdiction to deal with it.
Mr. Cullen, why is the NDP calling for a public inquiry on this?
Well, I represent quite a bit of the area that we're talking about, the so-called Highway of Tears, and before I got into politics, this was an issue that was under the radar of politicians here in Ottawa and was not talked about nationally because it's complex and there's an enormous amount of pain and shame in what's happened. I mean, if you look through the profiles of the women who have disappeared and been murdered, we're talking about the most disadvantaged in our society who don't always have the ear of the most powerful and in some cases not properly dealt with by our police forces. That's a recognized fact where I live, and R.C.M.P. members will tell you the same thing, that they struggle with how to get at this. This is where the sources come from. In terms of a public inquiry, why we have called for this for a number of years, this is not just recently because of the report, is because it finally exposes not just what's happening currently, but also the sources of this. Why are so many young Aboriginal women, as the predominant group in this category, going missing? And like I said, this is complex, but we think there ought to be solutions available so that we don't keep facing this year after year and just kicking the problem down the road. I know the Liberals will have a motion tomorrow talking about this in the House, talking about a parliamentary committee to do this, and when I think that's fine and we'll be supportive, but clearly the power is in the hands of the government to actually and maybe finally get at some of the solutions so that we just don't keep repeating this nightmare.
Let's bring in Mr. LeBlanc. You've sort of beat him to the punch a bit there. I wanted to ask you about the motion that the House will debate tomorrow on the murdered and missing Aboriginal women, on this proposal to strike a special committee to investigate the issue, report back to the House of Commons within 1 year. So you're not pushing so hard for the inquiry. You're pushing for this step first. Why?
To be fair, Peter, we, like the NDP, have been calling for a long time to have a full public inquiry.
Right.
My former colleague Anita Neville from Winnipeg, Bob Ray himself, we have been with the NDP asking the government to call a judicial inquiry. The government has so far refused. They have been tone deaf to what is a very, very serious tragedy unfolding, as Nathan correctly said, affecting some of the most vulnerable people. We think that maybe if the government has so far refused to call a royal commission, if the government announces tomorrow that they're willing to call a judicial inquiry, that would be an ideal solution. We don't have every confidence that after all of us asking for over a year, they'll do that. So we think a parliamentary inquiry will be able to hear from people, not necessarily about the individual and very painful and tragic circumstances of all of these women and girls who are missing or murdered, but what are some of the underlying societal factors that made them so vulnerable? Why have police forces, in light of the Human Rights Watch report today, perhaps been unable to properly investigate and arrive at conclusions? The number of these cases that's unsolved is completely disproportionate to other communities in Canada.
All right.
Peter, one shocking statistic, if you take the 600 missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls and translated that into the non-Aboriginal population in Canada, we'd be talking potentially about 20,000 women who would have been missing or murdered. I mean, this is a very, very difficult subject, and I think Parliament talking about it tomorrow hopefully will bring some attention and hopefully some healing.
I'm glad we have the chance to touch on it this evening, and all of you appreciate the time. Should remind our viewers, of course, as always, if that's a debate that interests you, and it should for many Canadians, you can watch that as always on CPAC right here tomorrow. Gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight.